The name hit Clyde Warren like a cold bucket of well water thrown straight at his chest. "Clara Hutchins," she had said, stepping down from the stagecoach with a battered leather trunk and eyes that didn't quite match her voice. "Clara Hutchins from St. Louis. I answered your advertisement." He had stood there on the dusty main street of Caldwell, Kansas, in the blazing June heat of 1882, hat in hand, boots freshly polished for the occasion, and something in him had known immediately, with the certainty of a man who had spent 15 years reading weather and livestock and the land, that this woman was lying. Not about being from St. Louis necessarily. Not even about answering the advertisement, but about the name. The name was borrowed. He could feel it sitting on her like a coat that didn't belong to her, hanging off her shoulders in all the wrong places. He didn't say a word about it then. He extended his hand and told her he was pleased she had made it safely and that the journey from St. Louis was a hard one. He watched her shake his hand with fingers that trembled just slightly, and he watched her eyes scan the street behind her before they came back to settle on his face. And he filed all of it away in that quiet, methodical part of himself, where he stored things he wasn't yet ready to examine. They rode out to the Warren Ranch in relative silence, broken only by the creak of the wagon and the occasional comment Clyde offered about the land, pointing out Caldwell Creek and the low ridge of hills to the northwest, and the particular way the Kansas sky stretched above the prairie like something biblical and overwhelming. She looked at it all with those careful eyes, and she held her hands folded in her lap with a stillness that struck him as practiced, the kind of stillness you learned when you couldn't afford for anyone to see your hands shake. It wasn't until they were nearly at the ranch, when the late afternoon sun was turning the whole prairie to copper and gold, and the ranch house came into view with its whitewashed fence and the great cottonwood standing sentinel at the gate, that she let out a breath so long and so quiet he almost missed it. Almost. "It's beautiful," she said, and it was the first thing she had said in 20 minutes that he believed absolutely. He let her get settled. He showed her the house, the kitchen with its cast iron stove and the good window that let in the south light, the parlor where his mother's rocking chair still sat by the fireplace, the room that would be hers until they decided how things would proceed between them. He was not a man who rushed. He had advertised for a wife because the ranch was too much for one man and too quiet in the evenings, and because he was 34 years old and tired of eating his own indifferent cooking. He had not advertised for complications, but he was beginning to understand that complications might be exactly what he had received. He went out to see to the horses. He came back in when the sky had gone deep purple at the edges. He washed his hands at the basin, and then he set 2 plates on the table and called down the hall that supper was nearly ready, and when he heard her footsteps coming toward the kitchen, he turned from the stove and said, quietly and without preamble, the words that would change everything between them. "Before we sit down to eat," he said, "I'd like your real name." The silence that followed was the loudest thing Clyde Warren had ever heard. She stood in the doorway of the kitchen with a shawl around her shoulders and her dark hair pinned neatly back, and she looked at him with those careful eyes going wide and then going very still, and he watched the war happening inside her plain as day, pride and desperation, and something that might have been relief fighting each other across her face. "Clara Hutchins," she said, but there was no conviction in it, just habit, just the word she had been practicing. "No," he said simply, "that is not your name. I do not know whose name it is, and I have not made up my mind whether I need to know that part tonight. But I am offering you supper and a roof and a fair chance, and I cannot do any of that honestly if we are starting on a lie. So I am asking you, before we sit down, what is your real name?" She stared at him. He watched her chest rise and fall. He watched her fingers tighten on the edge of the shawl. He did not look away because he understood that if he looked away she would take it as permission to keep the lie, and he did not want to give her that permission. "Theresa," she said at last, and her voice broke very slightly on the word, as if she hadn't said it out loud in a long time and it cost her something to reclaim it. "Theresa Finley." He nodded once, slow and deliberate. Theresa Finley, he repeated, as though setting it down somewhere solid. Sit down, Theresa. Supper's getting cold. And that was where it truly began. Not with the advertisement, and not with the stagecoach, and not with the lie, but with the moment she handed him her real name like something precious and dangerous, and he took it with both hands and didn't drop it. To understand why Theresa Finley arrived in Caldwell, Kansas, in June of 1882 carrying a borrowed name and a past she was trying to outrun, you have to go back 6 months, to a cold December in Jefferson City, Missouri, and a man named Douglas Hale. Douglas Hale was not the kind of man who announced his dangers. He was respectable on the surface, a businessman of modest but real means, a regular at the Methodist Church, a man who shook hands firmly and looked you in the eye. He had courted Theresa for 4 months with a patience and gentleness that she, at 26 years old and working as a seamstress to support herself and her aging mother, had found deeply persuasive. She had been lonely in the particular, grinding way that a woman alone in the world becomes lonely, not romantically starved, but simply tired, tired of every decision landing on her shoulders alone, tired of the constant calculation of pennies, tired of the smallness of her days. Douglas Hale had seemed like expansion. He had seemed like room to breathe. She had been wrong. By February, she understood that the church attendance was performance, and the firm handshake was a rehearsed act, and that beneath the respectable surface Douglas Hale was a man with a great talent for cruelty administered in quantities small enough to maintain deniability. A sharpness in his voice that stopped just short of a shout. A grip on her elbow at social gatherings that was 3 degrees too tight. The way he managed her movements, her visits, her correspondence, with such smooth efficiency that it took her weeks to realize she was being managed at all. By March her mother had passed, pneumonia taking her in 2 hard weeks, and Theresa had stood at the graveside in borrowed mourning clothes, and understood with crystalline clarity that Douglas Hale now represented every rope she had left holding her to Jefferson City. He had become indispensable through a series of small, calculated kindnesses extended during her grief, kindnesses that came packaged with expectations she hadn't agreed to. By April, he was talking about marriage with a certainty that didn't include her consent as a real variable. He had already spoken to the minister. He had already told his associates. He said these things to her not as invitations but as announcements, and when she had tried to express hesitation, something in his face had shifted, something cold and immovable surfacing beneath all that practiced charm, and she had understood that her hesitation was not welcome. It was Clara Hutchins who had saved her, in a manner of speaking. Clara was a friend, the only real one Theresa had left after Douglas had systematically isolated her from the others. Clara worked at the dry goods store and was engaged to a railroad man in Denver, and was leaving Jefferson City in May. Before she left, she pressed a folded newspaper into Theresa's hands one afternoon, while Douglas was at a business meeting across town. I circled one, Clara had said. Top of the 3rd column. Read it. The advertisement was straightforward. Rancher in Caldwell, Kansas, 34 years of age, steady income, own land, seeks correspondence with a woman of good character interested in a practical arrangement with potential for genuine partnership. Apply in writing to C. Warren, Box 14, Caldwell, Kansas. I can't, Theresa had said immediately. You can, Clara had said. Use my name if you're afraid Douglas will find out you wrote. He monitors your mail, doesn't he? Use my name. Get yourself out of here. A woman with her own roof over her head, even in Kansas, is freer than a woman waiting to become someone's property in Missouri. Clara had left for Denver, and Theresa had written the letter, signing it Clara Hutchins, because Clara had been right about the mail and about Douglas monitoring it, and because she needed the distance of a borrowed name to make herself brave enough to do it. The correspondence had been brief but revealing. Clyde Warren wrote the way he apparently spoke, plainly and directly, without flourish but with a quiet warmth underneath the practicality. He described the ranch and the work honestly. He mentioned that he wasn't a man who wanted a servant but a partner. He said he couldn't promise love at the outset, but he could promise respect and a fair wage for her labor and an equal voice in how the household was run, and that if affection came in time, he would consider himself lucky. Theresa had read those letters 4 times each. She had packed her trunk the night Douglas Hale attended a Masonic dinner. She had caught the 4:30 morning stage and hadn't looked back at Jefferson City, and she had spent the entire journey to Caldwell holding Clara's name like a shield, telling herself she could swap it for her own once she was safe enough that it didn't matter. She hadn't expected a man who could see through a lie before she'd had a chance to set it down. The first evening passed in a cautious kind of peace. They ate the supper Clyde had made, a beef stew with biscuits that was better than she had expected, and he asked her practical questions about her experience with kitchens and gardens and livestock, and she answered honestly, because the name was the only deception she had been carrying and he had already stripped that away. She told him about the seamstress work and the gardening she had done with her mother, and that she had no experience with cattle, but she was not afraid of learning. He told her about the ranch. 1,200 acres running along Caldwell Creek. Mostly cattle, a small herd of 20 horses he was building up, some farming ground planted in corn and sorghum. He had one hired hand, a man named Arlo Beckett who had been with him for 6 years and lived in the bunkhouse and was, Clyde said, worth 3 ordinary men but would never admit it. "He'll be suspicious of you," Clyde said, in the same matter-of-fact tone he used for everything. "He's suspicious of most things. But he's fair, and once you've earned his trust, you'll have it for good." "What about you?" Theresa asked before she could stop herself. "Are you suspicious of me?" He looked at her across the table with those steady gray eyes and the lamplight moving across the sharp planes of his face, and he considered the question with the genuine seriousness she was starting to recognize as characteristic of him. "I think," he said, "that a woman doesn't borrow a name unless she's frightened enough to need to. And I think whatever frightened you bad enough to do that is not a small thing. So yes, I have questions, but suspicion suggests I think you mean me harm. I don't think that." He paused. "I think you needed out of somewhere badly, and I think I'm the somewhere you chose to go. That makes us both in an uncertain position, but it's an honest one now." She looked at her plate. She said, "Thank you for not sending me back on the next stage." "I haven't decided on anything yet," he said, "but I'm not sending you anywhere tonight." It was not romantic. It was not a declaration. But it was solid ground, and solid ground was something Theresa Finley had not stood on in a long time, and she held on to the feeling of it carefully as she washed up the dishes and said good night and went to the room that was hers and lay awake listening to the Kansas prairie sounds, the coyotes calling across the dark, the wind through the cottonwood, the absolute enormous silence under all of it. And for the first time in months, she didn't feel the cold knot of dread sitting in her chest. The next morning, Arlo Beckett regarded her from under the brim of a hat, so worn it had taken the permanent shape of his skepticism. He was a lean, weathered man in his mid-40s with a face like dried riverbed and hands that looked capable of just about anything. He shook her hand when Clyde introduced them and said something noncommittal about the weather, and she could feel his assessment of her like a physical thing, methodical and unsentimental. "You know anything about horses?" he asked. "Not much," she said. "I'm willing to learn," he grunted. It was not approval, but it was not dismissal either, and she understood instinctively that from Arlo Beckett that was a reasonable beginning. She threw herself into the work of the ranch with a focus that surprised even her. There was a great deal to learn, and she learned it quickly, writing things down in the small notebook she kept in her apron pocket, asking questions until she understood the answers completely, and never pretending to know something she didn't. The kitchen garden had been neglected, and she spent 2 days clearing and turning it. She repaired 3 sections of fence between the house and the creek, using a technique Arlo showed her with a patience that seemed to cost him something but which he extended anyway. She rode out with Clyde twice in the first week to learn the land, and she paid attention and remembered what he told her. He watched all of this. She knew he was watching because she caught him at it, though he never made it obvious. He watched the way a careful man watches something he hasn't categorized yet, not with suspicion exactly, but with the intent observation of someone gathering information before making a judgment. On the fourth day, he caught her outside before dawn, sitting on the porch steps with a cup of coffee, watching the sunrise come up behind the eastern ridge. "You don't sleep well," he said. It wasn't a question. "I used to," she said. He sat down on the steps beside her. He had his own coffee. They watched the sky go from charcoal to deep violet to the burning edge of orange along the horizon, and neither of them spoke for a long time, and it was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of two people who were each learning that the other could be quiet and still be present. "You're going to have to tell me eventually," he said. "Not because I'll force it. I won't. But because whatever it is sitting between you and being here fully, and you deserve to be somewhere fully." She wrapped both hands around her cup. "His name is Douglas Hale," she said, and then stopped, because saying his name out loud in this open Kansas air was something she hadn't done yet. Clyde said nothing. He waited. "He was courting me," she said, "in Jefferson City, and at first he seemed like the right kind of man, but he wasn't. And when I understood that he wasn't, I also understood that I was already in deep enough that getting out wasn't going to be a simple thing. He told people we were going to be married. He'd arranged things. He was the kind of man who makes arrangements without asking." She paused. "He monitored my mail. I couldn't write to anyone without him knowing. So when my friend gave me your advertisement, I used her name because I needed his name not to know I was writing." Clyde turned his coffee cup slowly in his hands. "Does he know where you went?" "I don't think so. I told no one. I left in the dark." She hesitated. "I left in the dark because I was afraid of what he would do if I told him I was leaving." Clyde was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What kind of man is he, past the arrangement making?" She thought about the grip on her elbow, about the way his voice could drop to something that felt like a hand around the throat. "The kind of man who does not accept that anything he's decided belongs to him can simply leave." The sun was fully up now, burning gold across the prairie grass. A meadowlark started up somewhere close, that cascading, liquid call that Theresa was already beginning to love about Kansas mornings. "All right," Clyde said. "All right," she repeated. "All right, I understand the picture," he said. "You're not in trouble with the law. You didn't steal anything or hurt anyone. You were trying to get free of something that had its hands around you. You used my advertisement to do it, and you used a borrowed name because you were scared. That is a situation I understand." He stood up, and in the early light he was a solid, squarely built man who looked as rooted to this land as the cottonwood at the gate. "We'll proceed as discussed. You'll work the ranch with me and Arlo, and we'll see what we are to each other by winter." She looked up at him. Something warm moved through her chest, tentative and unfamiliar. "You're a very unusual man," she said. One corner of his mouth moved, very slightly. "People have said worse." He went to start the morning work, and she sat on the porch a little longer with the meadowlark singing and the big Kansas sky opening up above her, and something she could almost name as hope settling quietly into the space where the dread had been. The weeks that followed were some of the most genuinely alive Theresa Finley had ever felt. There was something clarifying about physical labor in open air on a scale that required your whole attention. She helped Clyde with the cattle rotation, learning the patterns of the herd and the geography of the ranch pastures. She and Arlo developed a grudging mutual respect that by the third week had softened into something that looked, from certain angles, almost like friendship. He taught her to ride properly, not the polite side saddle she'd learned as a girl, but the practical riding of someone who needed to cover ground efficiently. And he was a demanding teacher who praised nothing unless it was genuinely earned, which meant that his praise, when it came, was worth something. She made the ranch house into a home by degrees, curtains sewn from cloth she found in the chest in the spare room, herbs started in pots on the kitchen windowsill, a proper vegetable garden that by July was producing beans and squash, and more tomatoes than the three of them could reasonably eat. She was not performing domesticity. She was building something, and she could feel the difference between those two things clearly. Clyde noticed everything she did and mentioned almost none of it, but she caught it in small ways. The way he would pause at the kitchen doorway and look at the curtains. The way he slowed his steps through the garden and examined the plants. The way, one evening, he picked up a small clay jar of dried lavender she'd placed on the windowsill and turned it over in his hands without saying a word. "It's from the wild patch by the south fence," she said, not looking up from her mending. "I know where lavender grows on this ranch," he said, and set it back very carefully. They ate supper together every night and talked about the ranch, about the livestock markets, about the weather and what it meant for the corn, about small things and large things, about the news that came through Caldwell on the weekly paper, about books. He had a surprising number of books for a rancher, a shelf of them in the parlor, ranging from practical to historical to a battered copy of Shakespeare she hadn't expected at all. "My mother read aloud to us every evening," he said when she commented on it. "She believed books were the one thing that couldn't be taken from you because they lived inside your head once you'd read them." "She sounds like she was remarkable," Theresa said. "She was the toughest person I ever knew," he said simply. "Buried a husband and 2 sons, and kept this ranch going for 3 years alone, before I was old enough to take it on properly. Never felt sorry for herself a day in her life." "How long has she been gone?" "5 years. Something in his face, usually so composed, shifted slightly. "The house still feels like her sometimes." She looked at him across the table and understood that this man carried his losses quietly, the way he seemed to carry everything, thoroughly and without display. She found herself wanting to know all the things he carried. She found herself wanting to be someone he could set some of them down with. That realization, arriving on a Tuesday evening in late July, while she passed him the bread and he thanked her without looking up from the news of a cattle price dispute in Wichita, was something of a shock to her. She had come here for safety. She had come here for escape. She had not come here to fall in love, and she was not certain yet that was what was happening, but whatever was happening steadily, and with a kind of inevitability she couldn't argue with. She noticed, for instance, the way his hands looked doing different things. Rough and capable holding a fence post or a branding iron, unexpectedly gentle with the horses. She noticed the way he thought before he spoke always, as if words were commitments, and he took commitments seriously. She noticed that he never raised his voice, not ever, not to her or to Arlo or to the cattle, and that this consistency was something her nervous system recognized as safe after months of never knowing when Douglas Hale's tone would shift. Clyde Warren was, she was coming to understand, a fundamentally decent man, and she had not known how rare that was until she had spent time with what it wasn't. In early August, Caldwell had one of its periodic eruptions of trouble. Being situated at the end of the Kishome Trail, the town attracted a rough seasonal element when the trail drives came through, and though Caldwell had a city marshal and a reasonable degree of law, there were nights when the cattle money and the saloons and the temperature of men who'd been driving longhorns for weeks produced volatility. Theresa went into town for supplies on a Thursday in August and was at the dry goods store when she heard shouting from the direction of the main street. She came out to see a dispute that had boiled out of one of the saloons into the street. 2 cattlemen squared off over some grievance she couldn't parse, and a small crowd gathering. Marshal Henry Pratt was already moving toward them, a solid, unflappable man who'd handled the trail drive years in Caldwell with more diplomatic skill than anyone gave him credit for. She was loading her supplies into the wagon when she felt eyes on her. She turned. The man across the street was not one of the trail cowboys. He was too well dressed for that, a dark suit, a hat at a careful angle, a stillness about him that was different from Clyde's stillness. Clyde was still because he was fully present and had no need for performance. This man was still the way a held breath was still, controlled and artificial and about to release. He was looking at her with an expression she recognized. Her hands went cold. She forced herself to look away and finish loading the wagon without rushing, because rushing would tell him he'd been seen. She climbed up onto the wagon seat and drove out of Caldwell at a pace that said nothing at all about her thundering heart. She made it half a mile out of town before she realized she was holding the reins so tightly her knuckles had gone white. She forced herself to loosen her grip. She made herself breathe. It was possible it hadn't been him. The man had been across the street, and Douglas Hale had no reason to come to Caldwell specifically, no reason to know she was here. She had told no one. She had left in the dark. She had used a borrowed name. But she knew, with the part of her that had spent months learning to read Douglas Hale's specific danger, that it had been him. She told Clyde that evening. She waited until supper was done and the dishes were cleared and they were sitting in the parlor, which had become their habit, reading or talking in the lamplit quiet. She had not told him immediately because she needed to be certain of her own perception before she brought it into the room between them. "I think I saw Douglas Hale in Caldwell today," she said. Clyde set down his book. He looked at her with complete attention. She told him what she'd seen. She told him she couldn't be completely certain, the distance, the brief moment of contact. She told him she might be wrong. She told him she didn't think she was wrong. He listened to all of it without interruption. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and she watched him process the information the way he processed everything, thoroughly, without panic, without rushing to conclusions. "How does a man like that track someone?" he asked. "Stage company records, maybe," she said. "If he knew I left by stage and he found someone willing to look through passenger names, or he might have found Clara, asked her where I'd gone." She paused. "He is not a man who accepts losing something he considers his without trying to recover it." Clyde's jaw tightened very slightly. It was the first time she had seen any sign of anger in him, and it was controlled, suppressed, directed inward where it could be examined rather than expressed carelessly. "You are not his," Clyde said, quietly and with absolute finality. "I know that," she said. "I've always known that. He doesn't." "Then we will explain it to him," Clyde said. "One way or another." "It might not be him," she said. "I could be wrong." "You could be," he agreed. He picked up his book again, but she could see he wasn't reading it. "Either way, you are not his. You're here on my land of your own choice and my invitation, and that is a situation I will defend." She looked at the fireplace, at the low flames in the grate, at the way the light moved. She felt something crack open in her chest, something that had been sealed closed for a long time. "Clyde," she said. "Yes. I want you to know that I came here frightened and I used a borrowed name and I was not fully honest with you at the start. I know that. I want you to know that since the night you asked me for my real name, I have not been dishonest with you about anything." He lowered the book. He looked at her steadily. "I know that," he said. "I wanted to say it out loud," she said. "All right," he said. "It's said." He held her gaze for a moment that stretched very slightly past ordinary, and she felt the air between them change the way air changes before lightning, and then he looked back at his book. But the corner of his mouth had moved, and she filed that away with all the other small things she had been filing away about Clyde Warren. He was in Caldwell the next morning when the stage came through, talking to Marshal Pratt, who was an old acquaintance and a practical man who listened to Clyde's account of the situation without skepticism or dramatics. Pratt agreed to keep an eye out for a well-dressed man from Missouri, matching the description Clyde relayed. He couldn't act on anything unless the man caused actual trouble, Pratt said, but he could watch, and he could make it known that Caldwell was a town where you got watched if you were looking for it. 3 days passed without incident, and Theresa began to wonder if she had indeed been wrong. The Kansas summer rolled on enormous and brilliant, the days long and hot and full of work, the evenings cooling to something perfect, the night sky above the prairie so densely populated with stars it looked like something a person had dreamed rather than observed. On a Saturday afternoon, Clyde came in from the south pasture earlier than expected and found her at the kitchen table with the seamstress box she'd unpacked weeks ago, mending a tear in one of his work shirts. He stopped in the doorway and looked at her for a moment without saying anything. "Sit down," she said. "I'll have this done in a minute." He poured himself water from the pitcher and sat down across the table from her. She was aware of him watching her hands work. "I have been thinking," he said, "about what we are to each other." She kept her eyes on her stitching. "What have you concluded?" "That the arrangement I proposed in the advertisement was reasonable but incomplete," he said. "I said I couldn't promise love at the outset, but I could promise respect. I meant both parts of that. I still mean the second part." He paused. "I am less certain about the first part than I was." Her hands went still. She looked up. His gray eyes were direct and unguarded in a way she hadn't seen before, the careful composure set aside to let something honest through. "I am not a man who says things he doesn't mean," he said. "So I will tell you plainly. I have found in the past 2 months that I think about you a great deal. I have found that the house is a different thing with you in it than it was without you. I have found that I look forward to supper more than I used to, and it has nothing to do with the quality of the cooking, though that has also improved considerably." He stopped. Something flickered in his expression that might have been nerves, might have been the cost of saying all of this plainly. "I am not asking you to declare anything in return. You came here with a specific kind of burden, and I am not adding to it. I am simply saying that what I want, if circumstances allowed, would be a real marriage, not an arrangement. I am saying that to be honest with you, the way you asked me to be." She stared at him. She thought about Douglas Hale, who had spoken smooth and effortless words that turned out to be fences. She thought about how those words had felt versus how this felt, and there was no comparison at all. This was a man pulling the words out of himself with effort and offering them anyway because he believed honesty cost less in the long run than comfort. "I came here frightened," she said, her voice not quite steady. "And I have been letting myself be less frightened by degrees. You have done that, you and this place and the work and Arlo teaching me to sit a horse properly." She took a breath. "I have also been thinking, Clyde, about what we are. And I think that if there were no Douglas Hale and no shadow behind me, I would have come to you by now," she said. "I have wanted to, but I am afraid of bringing my mess into something that might be good, and I am afraid of trusting my own judgment because my judgment brought me Douglas Hale, and that was a significant error." "You were lonely and he was skilled at appearing safe," Clyde said. "That is not a failure of judgment. That is a failure of his honesty." She felt her throat tighten. She looked down at the shirt in her hands. "You are going to make me cry," she said. "I'd rather not," he said. "I'd rather you just sit with it and see how it feels." She laughed, which surprised her, a genuine laugh that broke the tension in her chest into something softer. He looked startled for a moment by the sound, and then something shifted in his expression that she had not seen before, something warmer and less guarded than anything she'd gotten from him yet. And she thought that Clyde Warren's smile, when it was real, was something a person could spend a long time wanting to see again. Nothing more was said that afternoon. But something had been established between them, a bridge from one side to the other, unstated but present, something both of them were now walking toward. 2 days later, Douglas Hale came to the ranch. Theresa was in the garden when she heard the horse on the road, and she straightened and shaded her eyes, and even at the distance of the gate she knew the way he sat a horse before she could make out his face. The knowing went through her like cold water. Her heart kicked up hard, and immediately she made herself breathe, made herself stand still, because running was what he expected and she was not going to give it to him. Clyde came out of the barn. He had heard the horse too. He moved across the yard with that unhurried stride that nevertheless covered ground efficiently, and he reached the gate before Douglas Hale had dismounted, and the two men looked at each other across the fence. She came up behind Clyde. She made herself stand beside him rather than behind him, because she was not going to hide, not here, not on this ground that she had been planting her own roots into for 2 months. Douglas Hale looked at her with eyes that were exactly what she remembered, intelligent and cold, and accustomed to having their instructions followed. He was still impeccably dressed. He had ridden from wherever he was staying, probably Caldwell, without acquiring a speck of trail dust that he hadn't already removed. "Theresa," he said. His voice was the same too, that particular smooth register that was pleasant on the surface and managing underneath. "Douglas," she said. "I've come a long way," he said. "I know," she said. "You should go back." His eyes moved to Clyde, assessing. "And you are?" "Clyde Warren," Clyde said. "This is my land, that is the gate, you're welcome to ride back through it." Douglas Hale smiled. It was the smile she remembered from the early months, practiced and placed with precision. "I believe there's been some confusion. Theresa and I had an understanding. She left without a word, and naturally I've been concerned for her welfare." "I have no understanding with you," Theresa said. "I left because I chose to leave. That is all the explanation you're owed." "We were to be married," Douglas said, and his voice carried just a slight edge now, the charm thinning. "No announcement was ever made with my agreement," she said. "You announced. I never agreed. You know the difference." "Theresa." He had shifted his tone to something that was intended to sound patient and was instead condescending, the tone he used when he was very close to something less controlled underneath. "Come away from here. I'll take you back to Jefferson City and we can sort this out properly." "She is staying where she is," Clyde said. His voice had not risen at all. It remained exactly what it always was, quiet and even and without any particular inflection, and it was somehow more authoritative than any raised voice. "She has not asked for your help or your escort, and she will not be going anywhere with you." Douglas looked at him for a long moment. He was recalculating. She could see it. "This doesn't concern you, Warren," Douglas said. "This is a private matter between me and this woman." "Any matter that concerns a person on my land concerns me," Clyde said. "That is as plain as I can make it." "Theresa," Douglas said again, dropping the smooth tone now, letting something harder through. "I have done a great deal to find you. I have invested time and money in this search. I think you owe me the courtesy of a conversation at the very least." "I owe you nothing," she said, and she meant it completely, without anger but with a certainty she hadn't fully possessed 2 months ago. "Whatever you spent searching for me was your choice. I did not ask you to. I left, which was my right, and I have made a life here, which is also my right." Something shifted in Douglas Hale's face then, the practiced surface cracking just enough to show what was underneath, and it was exactly what she had feared it was. Not grief. Not genuine hurt, but fury at not being obeyed. The fury of a man who understood women as property and could not process that a piece of his property had simply walked away. "You used a false name," he said. "You committed fraud." "She used a name," Clyde said, "and came to this ranch legally, through a correspondence she entered willingly, and has worked this land honestly for 2 months. If you'd like to discuss fraud with someone, I suggest you ride back to Caldwell and find a lawyer, because any lawyer in this territory is going to tell you that a woman leaving a situation she wasn't happy in is not fraud." Douglas Hale stared at him, then at her. The fury was very close to the surface now, and she braced herself because she knew what was right behind the fury. "You embarrassed me," he said quietly, directly to Theresa. "I told people we were to be married. I told them, and you ran off like a coward." "Yes," she said. She kept her voice steady. "I left. I am sorry if it was embarrassing. I was not trying to embarrass you. I was trying to save myself." She looked at him clearly, without the fear that had lived in her chest all those months in Jefferson City, and she understood that the fear was gone, not because she was certain he couldn't hurt her, but because she was standing on her own ground now with her own name, and there was a man beside her who would not move. "Please go, Douglas. There is nothing here for you. There is nothing here to recover. I am not yours, and I was never yours, and I am asking you plainly to leave." He sat on his horse for a moment longer, and she could see him weighing his options, and she understood that what he was weighing was whether making more trouble here was worth the cost, whether the resources it would require to push further matched the return of having a woman who would never be compliant with him. And the calculation came back as it always did with men like Douglas Hale, not in her favor but in his. What he was losing here was not her. He barely knew her. What he was losing was the thing he thought she represented. He pulled the horse's head around. He didn't say another word. He rode back through the gate and down the road toward Caldwell, and she watched him until the dust settled behind him. Then her legs stopped cooperating. She didn't fall. She caught herself against the fence post and leaned there for a moment with her eyes closed and the full force of the past months moving through her in a wave she hadn't been able to let herself feel until right now. She felt Clyde's hand on her shoulder, not gripping, not managing, just present. "He's gone," he said. "I know," she said. Her voice sounded strange to her own ears. "You did that very well," he said. She laughed, a shaky, somewhat watery laugh. "Did I?" "I couldn't feel my hands for the last 2 minutes of it." "You couldn't tell," he said. "You looked like you were made of iron." She turned to look at him. His hand was still on her shoulder, and he was looking at her with those steady gray eyes and something in them she didn't have a word for yet but recognized in the way you recognize something important before you know what to call it. "Thank you," she said, "for standing there." "That's not a thing that needs thanking," he said. "It does," she said. "It does from me." He held her gaze. Then, with the same careful deliberateness he applied to everything, he moved his hand from her shoulder to her hand, and he held it. And they stood at the gate of the Warren Ranch in the August heat, and she held onto his hand like it was the most natural thing in the world, which was how she knew, finally, completely, what she had been walking toward all this time. She told Clyde everything that evening. Not just the outline she'd given him before, but the whole of it. Douglas Hale in all his specificity. The small cruelties and the arrangement-making, and the way he'd isolated her from her friends, and monitored her mail and the night she'd left in the dark with her trunk and her borrowed name, and her heart knocking against her ribs so hard she'd thought it might give her away. Clyde listened to all of it the way he listened to everything, without interruption, without the expression that sometimes crossed people's faces when they were waiting for you to finish so they could offer their judgment. He just listened, and when she was done he said, "You did the right thing, every step of it. Using the name and getting on the stage and coming here and standing at that fence today." "I should have left sooner," she said. "Maybe," he said, "but you left, that's the relevant thing." "Do you think you'll be back?" she asked. "I don't think so," Clyde said. "A man like that calculates cost and benefit. What you offered was diminishing returns. What it would cost him to push further here is more than he's willing to spend on pride." He paused. "But I'll let Pratt know he's in the area. And Arlo will keep a closer eye on things for a while." "I don't want to make trouble for you," she said. "Theresa." He said her name with a quiet firmness that pulled her eyes to his face. "You are not making trouble. You are someone I want to protect, and that is not a burden to me. Please stop apologizing for having a past. Everyone has one." She looked at him for a long moment. The lamp was burning low, and the night sounds of the prairie were coming in through the open window, and the curtains she had made were moving gently in the evening breeze. "What is yours?" she asked. "What is the past Clyde Warren carries quietly?" He was still for a moment. Then he said, "There was a woman. 8 years ago. Her name was Miriam. We were planning to marry. She decided Kansas was not what she wanted. She went back east. I do not blame her for it. The land is not easy, and I could not leave it, and we were honest with each other about those things even when it was painful." He paused. "After that I put the thought of marriage to the side for a long time. I told myself it was impractical, that the ranch needed all of me, which was also a way of protecting myself from trying again." "And the advertisement?" she asked. "The advertisement was me deciding that protecting myself was costing me something I actually wanted," he said. She absorbed this. She thought about the loneliness she had heard running quietly underneath his practical letters, the thread of wanting something real that had wound through all those measured words about partnership and respect. "We are a pair," she said softly, "both of us hiding inside practical arrangements." He looked at her, and this time he let her see all of it, the hope and the caution and the wanting, not filtered through composure but plain and undefended. "I don't want to hide any more," he said. "Neither do I," she said. He reached across the table and took her hand again, and this time she turned her palm up to meet his, and they sat that way for a long time in the low lamplight while the prairie night breathed around them, and all the fear she had carried for months continued its slow, steady work of dissolving. By September, Marshal Pratt confirmed that Douglas Hale had indeed left Caldwell and, as best they could tell, returned to Missouri. There was a part of Theresa that expected to feel the need to keep watching for him around every corner, but to her own surprise, the anxiety faded faster than she expected. She thought about what Clyde had said, that a man like that calculated cost and benefit, and she believed it now in a way she hadn't been able to while she was in Jefferson City, because from inside the threat everything had seemed enormous and permanent. But seen from this distance on this land with this man beside her, Douglas Hale was revealed as exactly what he was, a small and frightened person who needed compliance to feel powerful, and she had stopped complying. And that had removed his power as effectively as cutting a fence wire. She was free. The understanding of it arrived in her fully one morning in mid-September when she rode out to the south pasture to check the fence line, and stopped on the ridge that overlooked the creek and the full width of the Warren land. And the autumn sky was enormous and high, and a particular shade of blue that doesn't exist anywhere but the Kansas prairie in September. And she said out loud to no one in particular, "I am free." And she meant it in every way the word could mean anything. She came home with wildflowers she'd picked at the creek and put them in the pottery jar on the kitchen table, and when Clyde came in from the barn he stopped and looked at them, and then at her with an expression that made her feel warm from the inside out. "Good ride," he said. "Perfect," she said. He kissed her for the first time that evening, and it was not the result of any dramatic moment or moonlit configuration of events, but simply the result of both of them standing in the kitchen after supper close enough that the space between them had become ridiculous, and him looking at her for a moment, and then crossing those last few inches with the same quiet deliberateness he applied to everything. It was brief. It was warm. It was the most honest kiss she had ever experienced, and when he pulled back he looked at her steadily and she looked at him and she said, "Again," and he obliged. Arlo Beckett, who came into the kitchen to return a coffee cup, and found them standing by the stove with their foreheads touching, and both of them looking exceedingly ridiculous and happy about it, turned around and walked back out without a word, though she thought she heard him say something under his breath that sounded like, "About time." They discussed marriage in the practical way that both of them were capable of, and that by now felt exactly right between them. Theresa was clear about what she wanted, which was a marriage that felt like the partnership Clyde had promised in his advertisement: equal voices, shared decisions, her labor on this ranch valued and acknowledged and not invisible. Clyde was clear about what he wanted, which was everything she described plus the chance to choose each other properly, not out of loneliness or arrangement, but out of genuine love. They agreed that the second thing was already happening, and the first thing was a matter of design. They were married in October at the small Methodist church in Caldwell, on a day when the cottonwood had gone full gold, and the air had that particular edge of autumn that feels like a gift before the hard Kansas winter sets in. Arlo stood up with Clyde, looking profoundly uncomfortable in his good coat, but there nonetheless, which was the most touching thing Theresa had seen in quite some time. A woman from town named Margaret Ellison, who ran the millinery and had become Theresa's closest friend in Caldwell over the preceding months, stood with her. The ceremony was simple. The vows were the traditional ones, but they both said them with a weight that made the minister pause and smile, as if he recognized that these particular people meant every syllable. After, there was a celebration at the ranch, a modest supper that grew large when the neighbors came and brought food, and the evening stretched long and warm and full of the particular joy that a community assembled around something good produces. Late in the evening, when the guests had gone and Arlo had retired to the bunkhouse, and the dishes were stacked and waiting for morning, Clyde and Theresa sat on the porch steps the way they had sat on their fourth morning, with coffee and the prairie dark and the coyotes calling, and she thought about that morning, how frightened she still was then and how unknown he was to her, and then she looked at him now in the lamplight spilling from the door and understood the full distance she had traveled. "Are you happy?" she asked because she wanted to hear him say it. Yes, he said, without a moment's pause, and the directness of it was so completely him that she laughed and took his hand and leaned her head against his shoulder. So am I, she said. Winter came and was hard in the way of Kansas winters, the blizzards coming down from the north with a ferocity that locked the ranch in for days at a time. But she had expected it, had been warned about it by everyone in Caldwell with the particular gleeful honesty that longtime Kansans apply to describing their weather, and she had prepared for it. The house stocked, and the livestock accounted for, and firewood laid in until Arlo said they had enough for 2 winters. She discovered that she loved the snowbound days. There was a quality of closeness that a blizzard enforced. The world shrunk to the size of the house and the barn and the short, difficult distance between them, that felt less like deprivation and more like permission to simply be inside the boundaries of what you had. She and Clyde played cards. They read to each other by the fire. They talked for hours about every conceivable thing, and she found that what she had initially admired as his quiet good sense ran much deeper than good sense. That Clyde Warren had a genuine curiosity about the world and a thoughtfulness about it that kept revealing new dimensions. He was interested in the Cheyenne and Arapaho people who had been displaced from the very land they now lived on, could speak with both knowledge and sorrow about the treaties broken and the suffering caused, and in this he was ahead of many of his neighbors, who preferred not to think about it. He said once, during a long evening when they had been discussing the news from Indian Territory and the ongoing conflicts there, that a man who couldn't acknowledge an injustice because acknowledging it was uncomfortable wasn't a man worth trusting, and she thought that this, perhaps, was the heart of what he was. In December she told him she was pregnant. She had suspected for 2 weeks and was certain enough by December that she said it over breakfast on a quiet morning with snow falling outside the window, said it directly the way she'd learned to say things to him without preamble. He went very still. She watched the information move through him, watched his face work through something private and then open up in a way she had only seen a few times, fully open, all the composure set aside. "Theresa," he said and stopped. "I know," she said. He stood up from the table and came around to her side and took both her hands and held them and looked at her with eyes that were bright in a way she had never seen and wouldn't have predicted, because Clyde Warren was not a man she associated with tears, but there they were, very close to the surface. "Are you well?" he asked, which was so very him that she laughed. "I am very well," she said. "I am perfectly well." "Good," he said, and he pulled her into his arms and held her, and she felt his breath against her hair, and the snow fell past the window, and the ranch sat quiet and solid around them, and she thought about what it meant to be held by someone who held you because you were exactly who you were and not who they needed you to be, and she understood that this was what she had been looking for before she knew what to look for. The pregnancy progressed through winter and into the Kansas spring, and with the spring came the full surge of ranch life that she was now genuinely part of, the calving season that required all hands and kept them running for weeks, the planting, the restoring of what winter had worn down. She worked as she was able and rested when she needed to, and Clyde watched over her with an attention that was not hovering but steady, the way he did everything. The baby was born in July, on a night when the heat lay heavy over the prairie, and the coyotes seemed particularly vocal, as if they knew something was happening. He was a boy, large and healthy and furious at being in the world, which Clyde said suggested he already had opinions, which Theresa said suggested he already had opinions about temperature, which was extremely reasonable. They named him Thomas Warren, Thomas for Clyde's father who had died young, and was remembered with the complicated tenderness of someone known too briefly. Arlo Beckett, presented with the baby the morning after the birth, held him with the focused terror of a man who had never been less confident in anything in his life, and then looked up at Clyde with an expression of absolute sincerity and said, "He's a fine boy." And Clyde shook his hand and Arlo pretended he had something in his eye and went back to the horses. Thomas Warren grew up fast and curious and loud, pulling himself upright at the furniture before the summer was out, walking in the fall, running and getting into everything by the following spring, deeply interested in the horses and the cattle and Arlo, who regarded the child's hero worship with a deeply touched gruffness that fooled no one. Clyde, as a father, was everything Theresa had thought he would be, patient and fully present and willing to spend time on the floor at the level of a small person investigating the world. She watched him with Thomas and felt a love that was different from but layered on top of the love she had for him as her husband, something broader and quieter and more overwhelming. There were ordinary difficulties, the seasons that were too dry, the cattle prices that dropped in 1884 and required restructuring the ranch's operations, a summer when the creek ran low and they worried about the livestock. But she and Clyde managed all of it together, sitting at the kitchen table in the evenings with the ledgers and the maps and the news from Caldwell, and talking through every option until they found the one that worked. She had never in her life felt so incorporated into the fabric of something, so indispensable not in the way of someone who is trapped, but in the way of someone who is necessary and knows their necessity is welcomed. In 1884, a letter arrived from Jefferson City. She knew the handwriting on the outside and set it on the table for a moment before she opened it, gathering herself. When she did, she found that it was not from Douglas Hale but from a woman she had known slightly in Jefferson City, a woman named Ruth Dawson, who wrote to say that Douglas Hale had married in April of that year, a woman from a merchant family in St. Louis, and that as far as Ruth knew he was doing well enough in business and had, apparently, moved on entirely. Theresa sat with the letter for a while. She felt nothing complicated. She felt nothing she needed to examine. She felt, if anything, a mild and complete disinterest in Douglas Hale's subsequent life, and something like gratitude that it had turned out to be so irrelevant to her own. She told Clyde when he came in for supper. He read the letter and handed it back. "Good," he said. "That's all," she said. "That's all," he said. "Would you like me to feel more?" "No," she said. "No, good is exactly right." She put the letter in the stove and watched it burn. By the autumn of 1885, the Warren Ranch had grown. Clyde had purchased an additional 400 acres to the south that had come available when a neighboring family moved to Oregon, and they had expanded the horse operation that was becoming, according to everyone in the area with an opinion on horses, one of the best in southern Kansas. Theresa had taken on the bookkeeping for the operation in addition to everything else, having discovered that she had a genuine aptitude for numbers that no one, including herself, had known about before it had the room to emerge. Thomas, at 3, had taken to following Arlo around with such determination and frequency that Arlo had begun, with great ceremony and no acknowledgement that it meant anything to him, teaching the boy to properly brush down a horse. Clyde watched this from the fence one afternoon and came and found Theresa in the garden and said, "Arlo's teaching Thomas the horses," in a voice that was doing a great deal of work to remain ordinary, and she put down her hoe and went with him to watch, and they stood at the fence together while the weathered, unsentimental man and the small, serious boy moved through the lesson with matching concentration. "He never had children," Clyde said quietly. "I know," she said. "He does now." Clyde put his arm around her, and she leaned into his side, and neither of them said anything more about it because nothing more needed to be said. She told him about the second baby on a January morning in 1886, the same way she told him about the first, over breakfast with snow falling. He reacted with slightly more composure this time, having had the experience to know what was coming, and then slightly less composure a moment later when the full weight of it hit him all over again, and she watched that progression and loved him for every second of it. "2 of them," he said, looking somewhat stunned. "That is generally how the arithmetic works," she said. He laughed, which was a sound she had worked very hard for in the early days and now had readily available whenever she needed it, and he pulled her close and held her in the kitchen, while the snow fell past the window, and Thomas, having woken earlier than usual and found the kitchen empty, appeared in the doorway in his nightshirt with his father's gray eyes and his mother's dark hair, and an expression of profound suspicion about whatever was happening. "Come here," Clyde said, and held out his arm, and Thomas came and fitted himself into their embrace with the comfortable certainty of a small person who had never had reason to doubt that he was wanted. And Theresa held them both and thought that this exact moment, was what she had chosen when she had been too frightened to know what she was choosing. The second baby was a girl, born in August of 1886, robust and serene, in a way her brother had absolutely not been, entering the world with a quality of looking around and assessing the situation before committing to any particular response. They named her Me, after Clyde's mother, and Clyde held her on the first evening with the same expression he had worn holding Thomas, that full open face she rarely saw and treasured every time. Thomas regarded his sister with a scientist's cautious interest that within 2 weeks had converted entirely into proprietary devotion, which caused Arlo to observe that the boy had good instincts about what mattered. Caldwell in 1886 was a changed town from the wild trail drive years. The cattle trade was shifting as the railroads pushed further west, and the great Kisham Trail drives became less economically necessary, and Caldwell was in the process of becoming a different kind of place, quieter, more settled, building toward the permanence of a real town rather than the seasonal volatility of a trailhead. There were more families, more schools, more of the infrastructure of lasting community. Theresa was part of building that community in ways she hadn't anticipated. She served on the committee that organized the first proper school in the area, contributing not just the organizational work, but the educational perspective of someone who understood what it meant to have access to learning and what it meant not to have it. She advocated for the school to serve all the children in the area, including those whose families were among the recently arrived freedmen communities settling in southern Kansas, which was not a universally popular position, but which she held without apology and which Clyde backed without being asked. He had, in this as in everything, a way of making his support felt without overriding her voice. He did not speak for her. He stood beside her. It was, she had come to understand, the most valuable form of partnership she could have imagined, and she had not had the imagination to envision it before she'd experienced it. On the evening of their 5th wedding anniversary in October of 1887, Clyde came in from the barn to find the kitchen filled with the smell of the good supper she'd been cooking all afternoon, the lamp burning warm, both children asleep, and a table set with the good china that had been his mother's and that came out only for occasions of particular significance. He stopped in the doorway and looked at all of it and then looked at her. "Sit down," she said. "Supper's ready." He came in and sat down, and she served the meal, and they ate together the way they always did, talking about everything and nothing, the ranch and the horses and Thomas's recent insistence that he was old enough to do whatever Arlo was doing, and Me's apparent belief that she could communicate complex preferences through expression alone, without the inconvenience of speech. After the meal she cleared the plates and brought out the apple cake she'd made that morning, and she cut him a piece and set it in front of him, and then sat down and looked at him across the table with 5 years between the woman who had climbed off that stagecoach with a borrowed name and the woman she was now, and she felt the full weight and fullness of the distance. "5 years ago," she said, "you asked me for my real name before supper." He smiled. That smile, which she had worked so hard for in those early weeks and which now lived close to the surface, accessible and genuine. "I did," he said. "It was the bravest thing anyone had done for me in a long time," she said. Demanding honesty, not accepting the false thing to make it easier. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "You were the one who told the truth," he said. "That was the brave part." "We were both brave," she said. "I think that is why it worked." He turned her hand over and held it, looking at her in the lamplight with 5 years of shared mornings and hard seasons and good evenings and 2 children sleeping down the hall and a ranch that was the work of both their lives in everything they'd built together visible in his expression. "Theresa Finley Warren," he said. "Clyde Warren," she said. "Are you happy?" He asked the same question she'd asked him on the night they were married. "Entirely," she said. "Are you?" "More than I knew was possible when I wrote that advertisement," he said. She laughed and squeezed his hand, and he squeezed back. And outside the Kansas night pressed close, and the coyotes called across the dark prairie, and the cottonwood at the gate moved in the October wind. And in the house that had been a lonely man's house and was now a family's home, in the kitchen where she had first told him her real name, and he had told her to sit down and eat, the lamp burned warm and steady. In the years that followed, the Warren Ranch became the kind of place a community grows around. Neighbors came for advice on livestock, and the Warrens gave it freely. Travelers came and were fed. Children from the surrounding area learned to ride on Warren horses under Arlo's demanding tutelage, and Arlo, who had grown old on that land with them, and who showed his aging with the same gruff stoicism he showed everything, was never alone because there were always children in his vicinity, a fact he complained about frequently and arranged for constantly. Thomas Warren, at 10, was a serious and capable boy who had his father's gift for quiet observation and his mother's directness, and who announced at the supper table one October evening that he intended to be a veterinarian when he was grown, having determined that what interested him most was the interior mechanisms of animals. Clyde and Theresa looked at each other across the table, and then back at their son, and Clyde asked him what had led him to that conclusion, and Thomas delivered a careful, thorough answer that made Theresa think of a man pulling words out of himself with effort, and offering them anyway because honesty was worth the cost. Me Warren, at 8, was her own distinct and formidable person, with her father's steadiness and her mother's tenacity, and a clarity about what she wanted and didn't want that rendered her completely immune to pressure of any kind, which caused Arlo to say that God had thought carefully before making that one. In the spring of 1892, a third child arrived. Another boy, Martin, named for no one in particular, but the name feeling right when Theresa said it out loud in the hospital bed with the new baby in her arms, and Clyde sitting in the chair beside her with his hand over both of hers. Martin arrived easy and loud and remained that way, the most extroverted Warren by a significant margin, which his father regarded with baffled affection and his mother recognized with deep amusement as the thing she had been before the years of fear had taught her to be small. Martin would not be small. She was going to make absolutely certain of that. Life on the ranch continued its seasons. Droughts came and were survived. Good years came and were celebrated with appropriate but not excessive gratitude, because Clyde believed that gratitude was best expressed through work and care, and not through the assumption that good times were permanent. He had lived on the Kansas prairie long enough to know that permanence was not the point. Durability was the point. Building something that could flex in the hard weather and hold in the good, something rooted deep enough that even the worst winters couldn't pull it out. That was what they had built. On a summer evening in 1895, Theresa sat on the porch steps where she had sat on their 4th morning on the ranch. The morning Clyde had come out before dawn and said she would have to tell him eventually, and she watched the sun go down behind the western ridge and listened to the sounds of the ranch around her. Thomas and Martin in the barn in some discussion involving the horses, me reading on the other end of the porch with the focused silence she brought to everything she did. Arlo's voice from somewhere near the corral giving directions to no one who needed them, and from inside the house the sound of Clyde moving in the kitchen, starting supper, and the smell of coffee coming. Through the open door, she thought about a woman on a stagecoach holding a borrowed name like a shield. She thought about eyes scanning the street behind her before coming to rest on a man in polished boots who already knew she was lying. She thought about the moment she had stood in the kitchen doorway with her shawl around her shoulders and heard him ask for the real one, and the war that had happened inside her, pride and desperation and something that might have been relief. She thought about saying it out loud for the first time in months. Theresa, her own name, returned to her by a man who refused to accept the false one. She heard the screen door and Clyde sat down on the steps beside her. He handed her a cup of coffee. They watched the sky go from copper to rose to the deep violet she loved, and the first stars appeared above the eastern edge of the prairie, and neither of them spoke for a while because they had 13 years of comfortable silences between them, and this was one of the good ones. "I was thinking," she said, "about the day I arrived." "Which part?" he said. "All of it," she said. "The stagecoach, the street, the drive out here, and then supper." She paused. "And you asking me before we sat down." He was quiet for a moment. "I almost didn't," he said, "ask. I almost let it go for the evening. Told myself I'd address it later." She looked at him. "Why didn't you?" He considered this with the deliberateness she still loved. "Because I had the sense that if I let it go for the evening I'd find a reason to let it go again," he said. "And I had the sense that whatever was behind the lie was something you needed to put down, and that you couldn't put it down until it was in the room." He paused. "I was fairly sure you'd leave if I asked. Get back on the morning stage and go somewhere else." "I thought about it," she admitted. "I know," he said. "I saw you thinking about it." He turned to look at her, and in the fading light his face was the face she had been reading for 13 years and still found things and she hadn't seen before. "I was afraid you would go, but I thought I'd rather know who you were and lose you than keep someone I didn't know." She held his gaze. "You didn't lose me." "No," he said. "I did not." She took his hand. They watched the last of the light leave the sky and the stars take over, that enormous Kansas sky packed full of them. And from inside the house, Thomas had apparently come in from the barn, and she could hear his voice and Martin's answering him and me getting up from her end of the porch to go in, and all the sounds of the life they had built together moving through the house and the yard and the warm evening air. "Theresa Finley Warren," Clyde said, the way he sometimes said her full name, quietly and with a particular attention as if he was marking the fact of her. "Clyde Warren," she said. 13 years, he said. 13 years, she agreed. He lifted her hand and held it against his chest, and she felt his heartbeat steady against her fingers, that reliable, quiet rhythm she had fallen asleep beside and woken up to for 13 years. And she thought that this was what safety actually was, not the absence of trouble or the removal of hard things, but this. This man and this land and this life that they had built out of honesty, and showing up and choosing each other again every single ordinary day. The stars burned brilliant over the Kansas prairie. The coyotes called across the dark. The Warren Ranch sat solid and rooted in the land that had held them, through the blizzards and the dry summers and the calving seasons and the children growing up in all of it, and it would hold them still, and the years would come and go around them, and they would face them the way they had faced everything, with their hands together and their eyes open and their names their own. She was Theresa Finley Warren. She had arrived with a stranger's name, and he had asked for the real one before supper. And everything after that had been true.